Welcome everyone to the University of Chicago, Francis and Rose Yuen campus here in Hong Kong. My name is Mark Barnico and I'm the executive director of the campus here in Hong Kong. Tonight we have an audience in person and we have a lot of people who registered for this program online on Zoom, and Facebook and YouTube is where we'll be streaming as well. So if you have any questions when we get to the Q&A on Zoom, you can do so through the questions and answer button on Zoom. If you have questions in the audience here in person, you can press the button on the microphone to activate your microphone and ask your question, and then turn it off when you're finished. I'd like to encourage you all to sign up for the UChicago e-news if you haven't done that already. You can stay up to date on all the programs that we have here on campus, and you can do that by going to uchicago.hk and subscribe to the e-news. So tonight I'm really delighted to have Dr. Caterina Fugazzola here with us. She's an assistant senior instructional professor at the University of Chicago. We've had the pleasure of having Dr. Fugazzola here with us this summer, working with young fellows, some of whom are in the audience this evening. And we'll be seeing more of her in the winter quarter when she comes back to teach global studies, which is her area of expertise. Tonight, she's going to talk about her recent book that was published in 2023, Words Like Water, Queer Mobilization and Social Change in China. Dr. Fugazzola is a sociologist who has research interests, which include social movements, gender and sexuality studies, transnational sociology, and qualitative research methods. Her work focuses on queer organizing in the People's Republic of China and engages with the strategic use of language and culture. And Dr. Fugazzola holds, we were just talking about this, holds a PhD from UChicago, as well as having her master's degree in sociology from the University of Chicago. We were comparing notes on our time living in San Francisco, where she also got her master's degree in Asia-Pacific Studies from the University of San Francisco, and a bachelor's degree in languages and economic and legal institutions of East Asia. She speaks Mandarin very fluently. She got that skill at the University of Venice, if I got that right. Maybe you can correct me. I'd like to have you all help join me in welcoming Dr. Fugazzola to come to the stage and speak about her recent book.
Thank you so much. My Mandarin has gone down the drain since I wrote this because of not practicing for way too many years. But hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. I am so happy to be here. This has become my favorite place in Hong Kong, this campus. So if this is your first time here, I hope you enjoy it because it's lovely. A good evening to you who are here right now in person, and then good morning, afternoon, wherever you are, if you are currently on Zoom. If you are logging in from Chicago, I'm going to try my best to keep you awake at 5:30 in the morning. You are heroes. I don't know if you are there. I kind of hope not. I hope you're sleeping, but I'll do my best to be energetic throughout this whole thing. This is a project that is very, very close to my heart because it's born out of my dissertation work. And if you have ever interacted with anyone going through a PhD, or if you've ever been a PhD student, you know that this means that this was basically my life for a number of years. So it has been a very weird experience to see this now become a thing that you can touch and you can buy, and it's out in the world. So I am very happy to be talking about this. So let me tell you about this book and about this puzzle that I set out to uncover a decade ago at this point, when I was a budding sociologist at the University of Chicago. So my research focuses on queer mobilization and social change in China. And at this point, I have grown accustomed at my interlocutor making a funny face whenever I say that. And this is, especially in the US, whenever I say like I study queer mobilization in China, what I get is usually just, this head tilt of like, queer mobilization in China? Is there anything going on? And I understand this is like silly and anecdotal, but it kind of is like the reason why I started doing this in the first place. Like it is kind of a motivation that is, it is at the heart of the research puzzle here. So the question is actually understandable if we look at the history of how scholars have studied social movements and how scholars have looked at social change, mobilization in general, because if we look at writing that exists out there that is on NGO advocacy. A lot of the stuff that we see is like, how do they understand change? Well, the parameters for change usually come down to structural change, policy change, legislative change. So in the case of sexual identity, a lot of the times what happens is that scholars have been looking at policy implementation in terms of legalization of same-sex marriage or same-sex unions, or is there any anti-discrimination policy? And even if we go beyond that and we look at tangible, like something that doesn't take tangible structural change or policy as a metric for change, a lot of what is out there really looks at activist experiences in Western democracies. So the focus is usually on political contention and it's on direct confrontation. And those are the main models for change that we have in a lot of social movement theory. So neither of these theoretical approaches really would get us very far in the context of China. And that kind of explains like the confused looks that I get a lot of the times when I say that that's what I'm studying. So the reason that I like starting here is that I want to take this confusion seriously, and I want to take these sensitive questions very seriously. So first of all, what kind of change am I talking about? So to get to that, I would like to guide you through what is the opening vignette of the book. So I'm going to guide you through an exhibit that I was lucky to see during my fieldwork in Beijing in the summer of 2017. So this is the exhibit. It was titled In Search of Lost Time, Queer Memories from Beijing. And what this was a vast collection of materials taken from NGOs, taken from queer artists and groups that were active in the capital at the time and that had been active since the early 1990s. So this was a living archive, and it was assembled in a very particular way. So basically you had all these physical artifacts and you can go and look, and then you would scan QR codes to understand what they were. And then there were a lot of empty cases. There were like empty pedestals or like prizes that were never assigned that queer festivals would have gone. And then there were like empty frames and things that were lost to either censorship or time. And at some point in this exhibit, there was a section on first times. It was titled First Times. And there was, for example, the signature sheet from like the first queer internet meeting in 1998. And then the first time that a lesbian tent was put up in the 1995 World Conference on Women in Beijing. So those were like very pivotal moments, like the first time that an organization was able to register and to get a physical center. This was the Beijing LGBT Center. And the messages on the walls in this section ask viewers to resist the desire to romanticize the past. And instead, they asked us all to look towards the future. So what it was on those walls was this writing that said the purpose of this exhibit is not to put the first on a pedestal, but to look at it as a point of departure. And then they asked, what has changed in that first time? And the very interesting thing is that for everyone that was standing in that exhibit hall in 2017, it was very, very clear that a lot of things had changed. So at the end of the 90s, that was like a turning point for a lot of queer groups. So same-sex behavior was decriminalized in 1997. And I say decriminalized because it was never technically criminalized. It's just that in 1997, the crime of hooliganism was taken off from the penal code. So in that, basically, that was a crime that was used mostly to arrest gay men. So that was a turning point. And then homosexuality was taken off the list of mental disorders in 2001. So those have been like incredible developments. And then, of course, the internet came along. The development of communication technologies really facilitated community formation, and people no longer felt isolated at that point. So I was there in 2017, and if you looked back at the decade preceding that, from 2007 to 2017, the number of organizations had gone literally from like a handful to hundreds. And some of these organizations had thousands of members, which was huge. So there was not a lot of tangible structural change, but the overall feeling in 2017 was one of really growing social acceptance and visibility. Now, if we go back and we look at the typical metrics that I mentioned before regarding social change, the story would be very different, right? If we look at change from the standpoint of political opportunities for groups and NGOs, then there was very much a tightening environment. It was going to be, it had gotten increasingly hard to organize, even then in 2017. There were shrinking opportunities for political engagement, particularly since the 2010s. And this was true in 2017, and it is particularly true now that we've seen in the 7 years that have passed between like my fieldwork and right now, we have seen just an increased policing of non-normative sexual behaviors and sexualities. And the position of queer groups in China has changed for the worse, but it has stayed from a legislative standpoint, like in a very liminal situation. So that position is marked by the 3 no's policy, the 3 no's standing for do not encourage, do not discourage, do not promote. So it is very much a gray area. And it is very much up for interpretation. So the groups have to navigate this shifting, unstable environment. So from this, we have a bit of a split narrative, right? So if you're there with me in 2017, on one side, you have this big story of change, of things are getting better, there's more visibility, there's more social acceptance. And then on the other side is actually things are staying the same or they're even getting worse, right? And both stories are very much true. And what I was interested in it was the tension between those 2 stories, because that is what brings to the surface the theoretical problem that we have here, that we don't really have a way to understand those and to make them fit in our understanding of the social world. So that is what my book focuses on, basically, and the puzzle that guides it. So I was curious to see how do we understand and conceptualize social change in absence of political contention, in absence of direct confrontation, when the metrics that we have in the literature don't quite fit. And then specifically, I focus on queer groups. So how do Tongzhi or queer groups in China create avenues for change under these conditions? So that's what I was asking. Now, of course, I am not the first person who noticed this in China, and I'm not the first person to talk about this. So I had existing models and I was standing on the shoulders of giants because a lot of people in the field of China studies had grown dissatisfied with the way that social movement theory understood social change in China, right? They could see that the theories were not quite fitting mobilization dynamics. So just to give you a couple of examples, Jing Wang coined the term non-confrontational activism in 2019. And even before then, we have Pamela O'Brien, Yanjiang Li, they wrote about rightful resistance. And then there was Peter Ho, Richard Edmonds that talked about embedded activism. And then there's like a growing list. Like that is the thing that is really cool to see since I published the book. There's more and more scholars that are trying to figure out a way to understand this non-contentious type of political engagement. So in the work that I'm sharing with you today, I'm going to build on this existing literature, and I want to explore strategies for social change, specifically in the context of queer groups in contemporary China. And the reason, aside from my personal interest in that, that I choose this topic and it fits, it is precisely because of the liminal positioning of queer groups that are not criminalized, but also not accepted. And particularly in the second half of 2010s, they were experiencing this split of having like relative degrees of freedom because of state disinterest, basically. Like if you remember the 3 no's policy that kind of signals disinterest is, you know, you do your thing, just don't be political and it's fine. I don't want to hear about it. That was like basically the situation in 2017. And then on the other side, because they are sexual identity groups, they are also tied and like caught up into a lot of transnational dynamics, because a lot of the discourse that comes out, it comes out from the West, it's in English. And so this Western Anglophone discourse that promotes out and proud sexuality and the idea of LGBT rights as human rights, and then very individualistic in terms of the framing, which doesn't quite fit neither the political nor social context that I was looking at. So that was a situation which made it like a very interesting puzzle. So my plan for today is to focus on the parts of the book where I try to disentangle all of this mess, because I do love the mess and I love embracing the mess, but I like it even more when I can disentangle a little bit. So I look at all these like multiple social and cultural and political constraints that are faced by queer groups. And in particular, I like to look at the strategic approaches that groups have found, because that was kind of the way that I got into it. Like the first time I approached this topic was because I was talking with a friend of mine and he said, well, literally citing him, like I said, well, you're interested in doing LGBT work and you miss doing work on China, because I had taken a break to study Italy for a little bit. And he said, well, why don't you look at LGBT groups in China? And I was like, Do I look at what? And then I started like frantically Googling, and the creativity that I saw and like all the things that I had not been aware of and all the different strategies just got my attention. And then I turned that into a multi-year project. So that is where I wanted to go. So in my work specifically, I focus on the strategic use of language and culture and on the discursive tactics that I observed in the field. Some were successful, some were less successful. All of them were just fascinating to observe. And I will get back to this towards the end, but it's very important to know that as an ethnographer, I am subject to every ethnographer's curse of time passing as we type and passing faster than we can type and publish. So just so you know, like all the observations, the stories, the interviews that I'm going to share with you today, they are based on data that I collected between 2016 and 2019, with the vast majority of field observations that are taking place in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou during the summer of 2017. And I see that this is very important to note, because that is, like, I call that the summer of hope. Like, that was a very clear, like, optimistic moment. There was like a tightening of political spaces that was very clearly felt, but a lot of the groups were in high spirits. A lot were celebrating their 10-year anniversary. A lot of them had been founded like in 2007 or 2008. So there was like this big, like, this is our moment. It's been 10 years. Things are changing for the best. And then, of course, the mood has shifted greatly since I have done my observations in the field. And the groups have been right now forced to adapt. In some cases, they have been forced to shut down. A lot of them have gone underground at this point. The question then that I get is like, well, then does it even make sense to focus on change? And I think, yes, absolutely. That actually, this is like the reason why this is even more important. Because as I will show, some of the strategies that I talk about are strategies that are designed to work in moments of tightening political, of a tightening political situation and of a shrinking of political opportunities. So I do think that it's even more important now to study this. So starting and actually going back to the question that I mentioned before. So how do queer groups in China create spaces for social change in absence of contention and political activism? So to start answering the question, I would like to introduce you to Fang Chao. So he is the main character in a short movie that some of you might be familiar with. It went viral a few weeks before the 2015 Lunar New Year, and the movie was titled Coming Home. So let me tell you about Fang Chao. He is an ideal son. He is a queer kid. He identifies as Tongzhi. But he's a perfect son other than that. He has top grades from a university. He graduated, top of his class. He got a great job, makes enough money to buy gifts for his parents whenever he goes back for Lunar New Year. And then, of course, every time he goes back, he is subject to the questions that a lot of you might have experienced at home, which is, when are you going to bring a girlfriend home? When are you going to get married? When am I going to become a grandma? When are we going to become grandparents? And of course, this is distressful for Fang Chao. So he cannot answer these questions. He's just trying to avoid. It's very hard for him to navigate that. And all he can do is just be quiet, don't answer, and hide his sexuality. But then one day, the pressure becomes too much. So he's crushed by all his expectations, and he decides to pick up the phone, and he has a tearful conversation with his mom saying, "Mom, I have to tell you this. I have to come out. I like guys." And there's pause. And of course, then there is silence for a year because the parents completely cut him off. Both sides suffer. No one is able to get past that. And then, of course, there's a turning point because we see at this point the viewpoint of the parents. The parents are browsing online, and then they come across a website. They come across the stories of other parents of queer kids, and then they start reading about the stories. They start reading about parents accepting their queer kids. And the following Lunar New Year, this time is the mom who picks up the phone and asks the son to come home. And that's the end of the movie. And then at the end of that, there is a series of messages from a bunch of other moms of queer children. And some of these messages are directed towards the kids. And they say things like, "Don't let your parents' love be a burden." And then they say, "Share the story of your life with your parents because they are willing to hear you out." And then the last message is directed to the parents specifically. And the message says, don't let traditional views of marriage get in the way of your child coming home. So I share this because to date, as far as I know, this is one of the most successful video campaigns in terms of like how viral this went. And this has been organized by a group that was formerly known as Tongzhi, translated as P-Flag China. This was at the time of my fieldwork, and I believe it still is, one of the largest Tongzhi organizations that was operating in China. They have since rebranded, so they are now called True Self. There would be like a whole other book just to talk about this, because obviously there's a very strategic reason for taking Xinjiang out of that. And it's all the more interesting to me because I had this conversation with the executive director when I was in the field. At some point, they had tried to register, and then one of the parameters was, yes, but you have to drop Xinjiang, you have to drop Tongxinlian from the name, and he had refused at the time. But of course, political conditions have changed, so there has been a rebranding. But the important thing about this group is that one is going to be kind of the focus of the talk today. This is a group that was founded in 2008. In the 10 years between 2008 and 2018, it had grown from quite literally like 5 people that hang out in a park at some point to 100,000 members. And it counted at that point 80 chapters. So that made it the most visible group in China at the time, and arguably right now. And then the particular thing about P-Flag is that the parents are really the public faces and the public voices of the group. So the focus is very much on the parents. Every single chapter of P-Flag has basically 2 parents in charge, and then there is usually a couple of children that help, but the parents are really the figures there. And the key characteristic of P-Flag is this emphasis on the family. So the group is very explicit in putting family over individual identity. They are very careful in doing that. They promote a cultural ideal that puts basically the stability of family relationships before everything else. And this is very clear in the way that they state their goal officially. So this is how they state them. And it's a very carefully thought out thing. So they say that what they do and they want to do is to enhance understanding and communication between homosexuals and their relatives and friends, and to create a harmonious living environment for homosexuals. Now, if you are familiar with the political history of China, or if you were alive in 2008, I am sure that you caught the reference to harmony right there. And that is, again, it's a strategy here. It's important because it's important both culturally and politically, right? So culturally speaking, reference to Confucius and Confucianism. So the idea is, it references this decentering of the individual in favor of the family unit. So the idea of it's not about individual sexual identity, it's about the positioning within the family unit, and it's about belonging based on the shared desire to have a good relationship with one's parents. Now, on the other side, which I believe is more interesting, this signals political belonging, because if you contextualize that in 2008 China, when the group was founded, that was the main discourse that was promoted at the time, right? So in 2006, the government put out the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee's resolution on major issues of building a socialist harmonious society. And that was the idea, right? That was Hu Jintao's favorite phrase. So it very clearly, the way that they put it on their goals mimics that. And it worked very well, right? Because that allowed them to be like, hey, we are in line with the project. This is what we're doing. We are for harmony, right? So there is a little bit of an issue though with harmony, right? Because if you think about social movements, that's probably not the first word that you connect to it, right? And even if you don't think about social movement, if you just think about social change, right? Change is hardly harmonious. So as a concept and also as a signal of political belonging, that creates a little bit of a tension. And the group's core mission deals with this tension, because I mean, this is also the way that they say it, like this is the way that they understand their mission, is what they want to do is to help more people to accept homosexual friends and relatives, to encourage them to take a stand, to improve the visibility and the living space of the homosexual community. If you put that in the context of harmony, that seems to be a little bit in tension with that, right? Because how do you tell people to take a stand and at the same time to be like, you want to be harmonious? And that's very hard to achieve. So that was my question. Like, how do you promote harmony while at the same time advocating for change? That seems to be antithetical right there. Because if you question social norms, then that's a disruption of the social norm. So not too harmonious. Well, what I found out is that PFLAG really, like their work really builds on this tension. And it is a tension that is dynamic, which I think is where the change is coming from. These do seem like contradictory terms, but there is something to gain when the two notions are brought together. So the key is, how do you bring them together? And the way that this group does it is through multiple steps, right? So one thing that they do that I will show you is that they manage to deconstruct specific notions of tradition while promoting other notions of tradition. They manage to associate some notions of traditions with a static non-movement, and then some others with positive change that is still manages to be harmonious. The other thing that they do is they rely on public performances or coming home narratives, and those are very powerful in promoting their goal. And then third, they strategically employ harmony to conceptualize change as non-disruptive, as non-oppositional. So we're gonna go through this, but before I do, I'm gonna show you a little bit of how this works with Feng Chao's story. Because if we think about that, it basically outlines the step of this switch to tradition, right? So if you think about the movie, at the beginning of the movie, we have Feng Chao's suffering that is very clearly connected to tradition, right? It's the traditional expectation of having to get married, having to bring a girlfriend home for Lunar New Year. And that is like, he is unable to fulfill the traditional expectation of a dutiful son. And that is what causes his suffering at that point. So as tradition demands, he's supposed to get married. That's what the parents want. He can't do that, and that is an issue. And then his initial silence is stereotypical. It plays on stereotypical understandings of what the reaction of a dutiful son is, of what harmonious behavior is, right? It's the stereotypical understanding of harmony is, well, you know, don't cause a fuss. Don't tell that to your parents, because otherwise that is going to be disruptive. So that's what is shown as problematic right there. So he avoids conflicts by keeping silent and erasing his sexuality. Now, this erasure feeds on a very stereotypical East-West dichotomy, right? Where the West is supposed to be the one that is disruptive and that is about me. It's me, this is my story. I will come out as an individual, don't care about what you think. I'll leave home. Like, that's the story, right? Of being out and proud. And then there is, in this dichotomized stereotypical idea, the East version is the one that is like, you know, submissive, not saying what is going on, be harmonious, family-oriented choice. Now, throughout the video campaign, PFLAG is trying to challenge this dichotomy, right? Saying like, this is just a non-starter. We cannot think of this in terms of East and West. This is going nowhere. So instead, that's when they turn the coming out into coming home. This term also has like a very interesting history in the queer movement of China. I'm happy to go into that a little bit more, but for now, we're just going to take it as coming out as coming home, because PFLAG didn't come up with the idea coming home, but they do have a very, like, this is like their twist on it. And in terms of tradition, if you recall, the final message of the PFLAG mom at the end is the one that specifically talks about tradition, right? That's the mom that says, don't let traditional views of marriage, that's talking to the parents, don't let traditional views of marriage get in the way of your child coming home. So we have some traditional expectations that are labeled very clearly as harmful to the movement and to identity and to just family harmony in general. And these are the traditions that lead to silence, to pain. They are very static. Those are the traditions of like heterosexual marriage. Those are all those traditional concepts that don't work and make everyone suffer in the story. But then on the other side, there are some traditions that are taken as the most important ones to uphold. So those are like the tradition of loving your parents, be truthful to your parents, don't lie to them. And those are traditions that PFLAG is presenting as dynamic, as the ones that will motivate you to create change and to go against its traditional expectations, right? Because basically the way that they're trying to twist it is, if you love your parents, it's more important not to present yourself as something that you are not. So that's the idea. And throughout my time in the field, I observed a lot of this reframing, the idea of seeing like unchanging and stubbornly traditional behavior being labeled as an obstacle to growth. It was one of my favorite things to hear. Like, the mothers of these children talk about like how they had embraced change, and some of them were like, oh yeah, you know, for tradition I'm supposed to be a grandmother and to look after my grandkids now, and then now look, I'm here on a cruise ship enjoying my life because I was at the time on an event held on a cruise ship, which we will get into in a second. So they were saying me all these things, and then they were being very sassy, like judging some of the behavior. Like there were people like, oh yeah, you know, I heard that their son is gay, but then he's also marrying a girl. Like, oh, so selfish. That is just like such a traditional mindset. And to me, that was fascinating because I'm like, yes, you are quite literally like using tradition in opposition to change, while at the same time, in the same sentence, saying like, no, no, we uphold the tradition of, you know, loving our kids, so we don't care if they're gay. I'm like, this is amazing, like the way that you can twist those two things and make them work together. So this is like the way that I find fascinating, that this is a reframing that allows this group to untangle this project of coming out, which they hold very, very dear, and they take it away from this China-West opposition, so that they're no longer being like, no, you know, in China, we don't come out because we care for our parents, but they're like, no, no, we come out. We're just not disruptive, because why do you always have to scream at people and say that the only thing that matters is you? We can do it our own way, and that works. So this is no longer a case of staying in the closets and fulfilling like this traditional duty versus, you know, coming out and screaming at everyone around, but it is a project of coming home. So this is a reframing that has very practical social implications, both in terms of visibility and in terms of like strengthening intergenerational ties. So, and one thing to note is that in this kind of coming home, the Confucian principles that are part of their stated goals to stay, because, you know, the respect for one's parents, that is never questioned. It's just reframed as like, what does respect look like? Does it look like lying to them because you need to be the perfect, beautiful son, or does it look like sharing with them and then building a future from there? And they have a very clear answer. So coming out as coming home is central to PFLAG's mission. And this is very clear in the emphasis that the group puts on the sharing of coming home stories. So this has been the case since the very early days of the group. And then they started online first, then they moved to in-person. And then they have a lot of like these public parents, children sharing sessions, and they have most of them throughout the year, but then there is a particular event that happens every year, and that is like their big conference. They call it the Cantanhui or conference. And I want to tell you a little bit more about these sessions. And I will talk about the ones that I attended during this one gigantic event that happened during the group's 10th annual conference. And it was a large scale celebration because it was their 10th year of holding this conference. So we were all, it was me, I'm somewhere right there in the middle. It was me and 800 of my research participants on a cruise ship. It was the best thing that could ever happen to an ethnographer. It was incredibly exciting. I did not get a single hour of sleep in a week, I think. But I got to observe a lot of incredible things happening. And I will talk about two major ones. But first, the first one is the sharing sessions. So let me tell you a little bit about the sharing sessions. So typically, these involve a parent that is sitting on stage, talking to the public, and then engaging in conversation, usually with a moderator. And then sometimes the child is present, sometimes it's not. The focus is always on the parent, though. And the first coming out story that I heard in 2017 was a mother that I call Wolf Mama in the book. And she was a veteran of the group. She had been to many, many sharing sessions. She had her story down. She was like kind of a celebrity. So when she went on stage, they were all like, yay, we know you. It was great. And she explained, she was from Suzhou. She explained how her daughter had come out indirectly, avoiding any direct confrontation. So the way that she put it, she said that, well, she never actually told me, she didn't dare telling me. And then she said afterwards, she told me that she didn't dare to say those words in front of me, those three characters, Tongzhi, that means homosexual. And then what her daughter did was like this sneaky thing. She took her mom's phone, she added a QQ group on it, and that was the PFLAG's parents group. So one day the mom picks up the phone and she's like, I opened it, and then there's all these parents being like, hey, our children are gay and it's fine, we love them. And this is a fairly common indirect approach, because it works a dual purpose, right? So on one side, of course, the daughter doing this is saying, well, mom, there's something that you should probably know about me. But then the key thing is that she did that, and immediately she contextualized it in a situation where the mom was not alone, but she was surrounded by a lot of parents saying that it was okay, right? So, of course, it's not as simple as one would hope, right? It's not simply, oh, well, okay, there's other people, fantastic. So after realizing the meaning of this, Wolf Mama experienced like a period that she described like it's very difficult, with little contact with the daughter. She couldn't sleep. She felt like she had a needle piercing her heart. And then she had a few heated conversations on the QQ group, right? Because of course that's what a parent does. It's like, who are you, a bunch of strangers telling me all of these things, and you are wrong. And then at some point she was like, I had to delete that group. Like I couldn't take the noise anymore. It was too much. But then she said that 3 months passed and she kept thinking about it. So this time she took a different approach. And she was like, I opened the group support chat again. This time I didn't write anything, so no arguments. And then I quietly watched. I checked out the links. I opened every link. I read everything. And then I felt so much better after reading. So, and in part, it's just like, okay, you know, before I was thinking, how could it be that my child is gay? I had never encountered anyone who was gay, and the concept didn't exist for me. And then one day I saw that there was a meeting, and then my daughter knew about that. So we went to this meeting and went to the sharing session. And that's how she ended up being part of PFLAG. And that was like her first sharing session that time. So even though both the parents and the child experience like a lot of pain through the process of coming home, stories such as this, oh, sorry, hold on. Stories such as this like basically create like this environment where neither the parent's reaction nor the child's action are labeled as wrong. Like there's no blame that is ever assigned in the way that these are presented. If you look at the next slide that I will go over, the real culprit becomes like traditional ideas. So this was the conclusion of her stories when she addressed all the parents present at the conference and say, I want to tell other parents, if you love your children, you must accept everything about your child, as long as your children live happy and healthy. Maintaining faith is of secondary importance. You are the source of your own fear. And now I've also come out with other relatives and our relationship is harmonious. And we all care about and love my daughter. And then she says, like, children, be brave. You should come out. Everything is better under the closet. So the conclusion, I love this conclusion because like you can tell that she's a veteran of this group because it's like a very studied conclusion, and it's like the words are picked very carefully. And it does cover some of the notions that I was discussing earlier. So no one is given blame except tradition, right? The idea of like, I was trying to maintain face. I had like this traditional mindset that I had to maintain face with everyone, and that is wrong, right? And then coming out becomes like a family affair. Because if you look at this, at this point, is the mother who's coming out to the relatives. Like she's even appropriating the language of coming out. And then, of course, we have the mention of harmony, right? Because that is the emphasis of this. Like this was a difficult process, but ultimately we are all happy. And we are all now living in harmony because of it. And again, like I say that she's a particularly good case because she's a veteran, because I've observed the other side of it, because like the emphasis on harmony is very carefully studied by the group, and I've seen that happen in real time, because sometimes the speakers are not the veterans and they don't necessarily use the language of harmony, but then their words are usually filtered through the group in subsequent publications, and I've seen that happen during the sharing session. This is the story of Fern Mama, who was a new member. She had just joined PFLAG a few months prior. She had ended up finding a boyfriend for her son through the group, which is also something that happens a lot. And so she was also in high mood, right? In high spirits because she was so happy. Some things don't change, like some traditions don't change, as you can see. Like you can have whatever sexuality, your parents will still try to find a match for you. But during the cruise, the conversation went like this. So she was sharing and she said, well, my son came out early. He came out 10 years ago. And then the moderator prompted like, and you accept it, right? And she's like, yes, it's because he talked to me so often and love him very much. He's an honest boy. I really trust him. And then the coming out process is painful for everyone, but for us, it went pretty smoothly. Now, as I was looking, like I was observing in person, and then I was also on all the social media websites to see like what people published. And then on the official publication, this story was rendered like this. Like her words were rendered as, my son came out 10 years ago because of our very good parent-child relationship and harmonious communication. I experienced almost no pain and I accepted a child relatively smoothly. So as you can see, there's not a lot of difference in terms of what, like, the content is the same, right? It's a fairly good adaptation. But obviously there is like some choice words right there that are picked because of the importance of that, of the term of harmony. So why am I talking about these coming out stories when I'm talking about change, right? So what are these coming home stories achieving? So one answer can be found if you look at their general structure, right? Each story is obviously a little bit unique, but usually they follow a fairly similar structure where there is an initial misunderstanding. And usually this is because of lack of information, incorrect interpretation. Many times is the parent saying, like, I had no idea what homosexuality was. I did not know these words. I didn't have the concept in my mind. And then this is followed by a transformative phase, right? Which is usually triggered through parents' exposure to information, most of the time through things that are provided by the group, because that's the group's mission. And then the third phase, the third act, is the final reconciliation, where these relationships like emerges stronger than ever, is stabilized. There is connection not only within the family, but there's like this big group of families that now share this experience, right? So it serves in a sense as a community building event. They do ease tension within the family, and they do reinforce the idea that there is a common element bringing all these queer kids together, and the common element is love for their family and the willingness to share with their parents, right? There are also those symbolic implications for that. Because if you look at these three steps in the broader context of Chinese society, then you get a slightly different story. So historically, we look at the family as a microcosm of society. So the parent-child relationship is a small-scale representation of the state-citizen relationship. So that's when it can become political, right? So in the coming home stories, if the parent represents the government and the child represents the queer community, you can see where the narrative wants to go. Right. So becoming visible in coming home stories is done like as a way to establish a connection. It's done not in a way to disrupt. There is no intent to create friction. It's actually rather the opposite. Right. It's a way to ask for inclusion, to create this connection with a beloved authority figure. And even if the parent's emotional response at the beginning seems to be the cause of a lot of the pain, there is, again, never any blame assigned, right? And then, of course, the group is also trying to promote like the group itself, right? So PFLAG enters as the key to fix the broken relationship, right? So if you translate that in broader society, this is PFLAG saying like, hey, Chinese state, you know what could fix all this disruption? We can, because all we need is the ability to spread information and to get people on board, and then everyone is going to feel better after this, right? So that's where PFLAG comes in. And then, of course, the final reconciliation represents the goals of the community as a whole, right? The idea is that these groups can become the potential educators of a well-meaning, but also very underinformed authority figure. So these are the symbolic implications, but you might also be like, okay, yes, great, you're sociologists, you've done all the symbolic work, but can we get to change, please? Like, how do you, like, I can see that you change your family, but how? I had this question too, so I asked around, because that was like what I was, bugging all these participants walking around me with. Because coming home stories do focus on family dynamics. They can become visible in the family sphere, but then how do you go from the family sphere to outside? So one of the veteran fathers that I met on the cruise basically put it down this way, right? So first of all, he started by saying that he had experienced many of the changes that we see in all the coming home stories. We need to keep talking about it. I didn't know about it. I didn't know what homosexuality was until my son came out. And then he put this words in there and said, well, in China's like that. It's very hard to change things from the top down. It's easier to start from below. So there is like this bottom-up model of change. And China works like that. Like if enough people are talking and discussing an issue, then people in power will pay attention. If there's only a few people, then no one will discuss it. And so that was the way that he basically put it into words. The way, and if this looks like a simplistic model of change, I'm with you, but bear with me a little bit more. because I will show you in a second that the focus on family harmony has, like PFLAG puts out, has very important political implications from the standpoint of visibility in the public sphere. Because focusing on the family like allows them to de-emphasize the political aspect, right? Like the idea of having parents as the main faces is strategically like very smart, right? The idea of like, who do we crack down on? Well, it's not going to be parents first, right? It's going to be the young people. So that has like important political implications. And then the alignment with the family and harmony centered discourse is a very critical step. And that allows the group to exist, right? To put out things and to publish things. It's a displacement of this political project. It becomes from being a political project, it becomes a family project and something that is playing into like the natural willingness of everyone to create like a more harmonious family environment. And I will show you in a moment with an example a successful event that relied on precisely this discursive shift. But before I do that, I want to address an important caveat that comes with the reliance on social belonging as the core identity of PFLAG, because particularly if you are on the younger side of the audience, and if you're hearing about the coming home stories and the emphasis on harmony, and if you're like internally rolling your eyes a little, I hear you. Yes, it is an important critique to point out because PFLAG contributes to the creation of a very particular ideal type of queer subject, right? And this is an individual that deserves inclusion into the category of Chinese citizen due to the contribution to society, due to the contribution of social, like towards social harmony. So there is like that thing to address, right? The idea of like, yes, but you are presenting basically an ideal son. It's just that instead of being heterosexual, happens to be queer. So there is a risk in there. There is the risk of the homonormative construction of queerness. And there is a risk of perpetuating social exclusions, right? Because that's the creation of a binary distinction between like a bad queer that is usually, it maps out into like uneducated, hypersexual, what is called like low quality in terms of like online discourse. And then there's a good queer that is exactly the opposite, educated, desexualized, high quality. I saw these a lot, like in conversations on the chats, like a lot of the times there were like a lot of policing of like sexual content and like a lot of the groups being like, hey, no, there's parents here. Don't post this meme and don't do that. Like there was a lot of like desexualizing queerness. So that is the risk of a single success story, right? Where the individual like gains inclusion by being like distinctly unqueer. So I think that's something that we need to acknowledge. That said, I do think that we should read this in the political context of China as a very deliberate and very strategic approach that PFLAG embraces as an avenue for further social change, right? We can have a conversation on whether like that, like what the limitations of that are, because we know that, you know, the trickle down has never worked in any context ever. But that is something that we need to contextualize in like what is possible and what is currently working. So let's keep this in mind as like a double-edged nature of, you know, these cultural concepts of filial piety and harmony. So they do risk, they can create belonging, but they can also perpetuate exclusions. So that said, with this caveat in mind, I would like you to talk to you about a particular event where PFLAG was able to use strategically the concept of harmony to push the boundaries of non-contentiousness. So come back with me on that cruise in 2017. Where PFLAG ended up making history by organizing the very first same-sex collective wedding in China. And this was a picture taking on the deck of the ship. I love it for a lot of reasons. I could spend like 2 hours talking just about this picture alone, because like we could be anywhere. Like it is the most liminal picture that I've ever seen. There's like, you can't even tell that we're on a ship. We are in the middle of the sea, in no man's land. Like we were literally in between countries. So it's just a perfect symbol of like, this can be done, but in a very specific context, at a very specific time, in a very specific way, right? But this was a big deal. Like, and the ceremony, as they were organizing it, it had the potential to raise so many red flags because, of course, you know, collective wedding ceremonies have been part of the repertoire of queer mobilization for a long time, and they have a very distinct association with like contention with the demand for civil rights. the timing also was like everyone was celebrating because like Taiwan had just passed same-sex marriage, and at the same time they were like, oh crap, this is going to put even more attention on this event, because then they're going to think that it's like a political statement. So people were very aware of that. So there was like a lot of potential for contention when organizing this. And as I was talking to the executive director, and like, or this is something that he posted online, he was acknowledging that, like, because he said like, well, we started planning this collective wedding of 10 couples, and then I was very hesitant, right? Because in part, like what he was thinking about, there's no legal protection, so can we actually give them a ceremony? And then what kind of ceremony can we do? Because we need to like have these couples get married, but also we want to perpetuate the image of the Chinese community, right? So he identifies like two problems. Like one is the obvious safety concern of like, well, okay, there's no legal protection, can we do it? But the other one is one that is more, it concerns the message that the ceremony would send, right? So for the organizing, it was very, very important that this was not going to be read as something that was like, you know, we're just getting on the bandwagon of collective wedding ceremonies. We're asking for civil rights. We're doing everything like everyone else is doing. So they wanted it to be like specifically Chinese. So the solution that they came up with, if you've noticed from the initial photo, was a traditional wedding ceremony. And of course, who is center stage in the ceremony? The parents, right? It was like barely any couples like on stage for like the first half hour. It was great. It was just the parents. Like they interviewed every single one of the parents of the couple, saying like, hey, tell us why you're here, tell us what you're excited about. And then the parents were the ones that brought the couples their rings. So they were also right there during the ceremony. And then of course they like passed the red envelope, right? Signifying their parental approval. So throughout the ceremony, the parents were really center stage. We had to like corral the couples for that photo and like get the parents out. That was like the hardest part. So, and there was absolutely no mention of rights despite the inherently political nature of the event, right? And the event was declared a success. And I could see that because we got off the boat, and the first thing that everyone wanted to do was go and buy a newspaper, because this was able to be printed out on both online and in traditional media. And this included articles that were published in Chinese on state-controlled newspapers. So this turned out to be a pretty big deal and a pretty successful thing. And then the reason that this could happen is because officially this had been not like a collective wedding ceremony to demand rights, but a ceremony to celebrate young love and the parental acceptance of young love. So the focus on the family and harmony, like I promise it's not just me saying it's strategic, it's actually the group themselves. They were like, yes, we know we're doing this on purpose. Like you're here observing it. We are confirming that indeed we do that. Like we do it with a purpose. This was an interview with one, like also like one of the old guards in PFLAG, right? Saying like, yes, we want to do this for the people. We do it for the groups who want to create family harmony. But then if we contextualize this on a social advocacy level, raising visibility is important, and we do need the cooperation of the media. And how do you get the cooperation of the media? Well, you present it as, look what we're doing for harmony. So that getting off the cruise, if we get off the cruise ship for a moment, one thing that I discussed is that this is all great, but also harmony is a bit of an outdated discourse now. Like this is now 2017, changed presidency. So one thing that I discussed is that looking at state discourse is a strategy that allows the groups to be constantly changing and constantly adapting, right? So this is a strategy that is important to navigate sudden shifts in political environment and sudden moments of like, oh, we need to be careful and can't say that. So they are able to adapt their discourses to fit the limits posed by the government without ever crossing the boundaries of contention. And I was there during one of such shifts in 2017. Again, if you were in China, there was a moment of like great panic because there was a VPN crackdown, which was not specifically targeting sexual identity groups, but a lot of the groups saw that and they were like, okay, this could signal something, right? So the VPN crackdown affected a lot of organizations. They had to like rethink things. Of course, then there's new VPN coming through, but for a moment, everyone was just like looking at each other and be like, are we going to be the next ones with a target on our back? So they were very aware that something was going on. And reading this as a signal that the environment was shifting, PFLAG asked all the local groups to include a new slogan on all the flyers that were advertising public events. And the new slogan, you can see this here, And he says that what they do is promote family harmony, mutual love among relatives, promote the health growth of the next generation, ensure that the elderly will be properly cared for. So, any ideas where this is coming from? This caring for the new generations, economic security, social and financial stability. We've changed president, and we've gotten to the Chinese dream. This is quite literally what the Chinese dream, like discourse, says, right? So if you look, these are all the elements that reflect this political narrative, right? Like this is part of like the way that President Xi Jinping, like this is an excerpt from a speech where he's describing the Chinese dream, and he's talking about going back to his own village, seeing positive changes that have improved the people's quality of life. And what he mentions, like elderly folks have old age care, children are in school, people are yearning for a better life. If you look at the wording on the flyer, you're going to start to see parallels right there, right? And this was a very smart decision because it allowed them to continue working on it. And then not only harmony is still there and they can still claim, well, we're actually working for a harmonious civil society, but they're also saying like, no, but we're also working on intergenerational strengthening of these ties. And then we are looking at the healthy growth of the new generation. So, you know, parents, children, and their grandchildren. So this is something that we are doing that matches the expectations, right? So in this light, basically all the group's activities are events that have very minimal social costs from the perspective of the government. Because even better than that, like they're actually events that fulfill the state-approved social function of moving towards the Chinese dream. So I hope this has convinced you enough for now, because I'm moving towards a conclusion, not quite there yet, but moving towards that. And going back to the initial question, because something that we love to do on our slides, we have, you know, beginning, middle, and end, exactly the same slide. Yes. So how do these groups create social change in absence of contention and political activism? So what I've done today, and what I would love to discuss more, is that PFLAG is an example of an organization that has succeeded at walking this like very difficult line to walk between like activism, visibility, tradition, change, being harmonious, and promoting social, like new social norms. And they do so by promoting change within the family, by putting parents center stage. They're able to do, by doing that, they're able to displace the idea that is political, the idea of acting for visibility of queer groups, into something that is familiar, right? Into the familiar idea of supporting one's child as a parent. And then, of course, the strategic use of harmony manages to put them on the same line as the grand project of a harmonious society that started in 2006. And then, of course, they are able to do so, and they are able to continuously adapt the discourse because they pay attention and they react immediately to changes in political shifts and to changes in political discourse, and they align themselves with this idea. So where this leads us on the question of change is something that is, hopefully I can leave you with a little bit of optimism, because this is how the executive director of PFLAG described the process of change in 2018. He put this in his words in an article. He says, few people are willing to follow the spirit of Yugo Nishan, which is Mr. Fool Move the Mountain. And he says, well, I also went through a period where I felt that this was stupid. And in the past 2 years, I've become particularly convinced that this is the spirit that will bring about change. So the 4 characters right there are an idiomatic expression. They refer to the story of Old Man Yu. So Old Man Yu lived in a house. In front of his house were 2 huge mountains. So every time he and his family had to go out, he had to go around the mountains. It took forever. So at some point, Old Man Yu was like, I've had enough, takes a shovel, starts digging, puts the part of the dirt in the sea. And then, of course, his neighbors and everyone around is like, what are you doing? This is the mountain. You're going to be doing this forever. You're going to be dead before you can move the mountain. And Old Man Yu looks around. He's like, yeah, I will. But then my son will continue digging. And then their son continues digging. And then so on and so forth. And at some point, the mountain will move, right? So this is a story of persistence. It's a story of you can chip away and it looks like you're not doing anything. But if you continue doing this and if you continue doing that with persistence, you can eventually move mountains. So I know that this is a strangely optimistic note to close on, given the fact that I've mentioned it before, like in the past 5-6 years, things have not been great for queer groups in China, right? Like the situation has very clearly changed for the worse. So groups and centers that were historical pillars of the queer community, they have been forced to shut down. And some have to move abroad. A lot of them have to like be on the ground as they continue their work. But the work does continue. And I am continuously amazed. And I love that there is now a whole new generation of scholars that are basically picking up where I left off in 2019 and then seeing what's going on now. And what is going on now, it's still something that is quite amazing. It's a lot, it's new ways to promote social change. It's difficult. A lot of the times it is less visible these days, but there is a lot that is going on in terms of creating change without political confrontation. So both what I've seen and what I see this next generation of scholar observe makes me quite optimistic, because in the face of tightening conditions, I think that there are still a lot of queer groups that are learning from the past and they are finding new and more creative ways to chip away at that mountain. So with that optimistic note, I'm gonna end and then take some questions. And I'll leave my email here in case we don't get to all the questions. So we can take questions here. I also have a few questions that were given to me in the pre-registration, so we can go in whichever order you would like. There's questions here. I feel like you made the trek to Mount Davis, so you get to ask the questions first. Yes. Yes, you can.
It's on if it's green. It's on if it's green. There you go.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for this. It's fascinating. And I don't know whether I agree with the Mr. Fool analogy, because it seems like most of it is more like the authority is dumping back the dirt back onto the mountain. So it's one step forward, two step back situation sometimes. But at the same time, I find it absolutely optimistic to see how the boundary, much of it is the strategies and them crafting those strategies. It's much like them also finding the boundary of the political closet, essentially. And my question is, in your research, do you see how they are aware of what might happen, you know, or what is a threshold of them crossing or opening that closet or crossing the boundary, essentially?
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. So I absolutely agree with you. Like I do acknowledge, actually, like I love ending on this with presentation, but in the book, I'm also like, this is a great analogy, but you know, the thing is, like, a government is not a mountain. That's part of the issue, is that like governments react and they change. So it's not the static thing that you can continuously chip away from. So you're right. Sometimes it's two step forward, like one step forward, two back. Sometimes it's the opposite. So that's the thing. It's like, it's a dance. But the thing is that no one has given up on the dance yet, like that I've seen. Like even if they're gone on the ground, they keep trying, they keep doing this. And on the testing the boundaries, absolutely, like that is something that the groups are very aware of the fact that there's no clear boundaries. So sometimes they can test it a little bit more. It's always like very tentative steps, and they always have like an easy retreat that they open for themselves. And sometimes it just doesn't work out very well, right? There is another chapter of the book that I talk about where there was like a P flag, like something that ideally was like, it looked on paper like, okay, this fits every parameter. It's a traditional thing. What happened is that the mothers went to the Shanghai park to do like the traditional, you know, finding a match for their kids. But then of course they wrote the characters, and then people were like, oh wait, you wrote the character wrong. What happened? Like, you're looking for a person, like a man for your son. You need to correct that. And they were like, no, let us talk to you about it. But what they did at some point is that they took out rainbow umbrellas, because like what they do at this event is that they're there with umbrellas, and they took out rainbow umbrellas, and then they took out signs, and they were like, I love my kid who's gay. And at that point, they were kindly escorted out of the park, but also threatened with arrest. And then the group was very quickly being like, oh, no, that's a problem, like, hold on. And also the interesting thing was that I think they misstepped on the tradition there, because they also got a lot of ridicule online being like, how can we, like, can we please get rid of this tradition? We don't need our parents to find matches. We can be beyond that. So, and that was a moment when they were like, okay, we can see that that's a no-go in either way, right? And in part, it was like, I talk about how that was like connected to the space. They were like in a park that was like a very political location, and the way that they did this, like with the signs and marching around, it was perceived very much as political. And one of the organizers put it like in those words, saying like, well, we were fine until the rainbow umbrellas came out, and then it became activism. Like that's the word that they used, and we're like, okay, and that was a no. So so they continuously test these boundaries, and a lot of it is just like trying what works, and then if it sticks, great. But they also are aware that sometimes what sticks one day will not stick the next day. Oh, yes.
Thank you so much for the talk. I guess I just want to ask for a clarification of the idea of coming home. So I noticed that the places that you did field work in are all big cities, like Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. So in those cities, there are a lot of like migrant workers who grew up in smaller cities or even rural areas, and they come to these big cities to work. So their parents live in the smaller cities and rural areas. So I don't know if the coming home that you describe are like going back to those rural areas, or like are their parents also in the city? Because I can also imagine a huge urban and rural divide, a divide in people's understanding and acceptance of queerness.
And there is, but I was also, frankly, like incredibly surprised by the amount of parents that were like at these events that were not from big cities. Like I heard story after story of the kids that oftentimes like the kids were away, and then coming back to like smaller towns, smaller villages. Like one of the greatest story was like this kid, it was like, I couldn't even prove to my mom that other people like me existed because I went like on a dating site and there was no one in the, like in the radius of my village that was there. So there was a lot. And some of the events that I went to, I only went to a few that were outside of big cities. And in part I had to stop just because I couldn't understand the dialects, and a lot of the times there was like a lot of dialect translation going on. And I remember at some point being in the audience and being like, wow, my Chinese has really gone down. And then the Chinese person next to me was like, I don't know what they're saying because they're speaking a dialect. So there's a lot going on. It's definitely on a smaller scale. But I did see, particularly like with WeChat, like there was like these parents were like staging interventions like after intervention. Like those, a lot of them were like retired parents with a lot of time on their hands. So like they would physically get like other parents on a train, take them to like someone's house, and then like the kids would all be like, we would all be hanging out in the living room, like playing games, and then it would be like in the bedroom, like the parents talking to the other parent, and then them coming out like crying, but also like comforted. So there was a lot of that going on that crossed the rural urban divide. The scale, of course, is not huge, but there were definitely steps.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for the speech, and it's really inspiring. So I'm really curious about, so what's the parents' attitude towards like the political context? Like after they accept this truth, do they like lean into their children, or do they like trying to make compromise between their children and the government? So like are they like protect their children by like this big wing, like to protect them? Or are they like weaponize themselves by using the concept of harmony, like towards the government?
They're doing a little bit of both, right? So that was like the interesting thing to me, that it was in like, for the parents, it was like, it was literally a switch, which is like, I don't care. Like the tradition is wrong. Like all these traditions are wrong. My kids should be part of this, but also they were like very much, like talking up the government and being like, I think this is misunderstood. Like, it's not that they're against it, it's just that they don't know. Because like, they're just like us, they were not informed, right? So they were more like seeing parallels between them and the state, being like, if only we could tell them, then it would be okay, because they would understand that all we want is like love our children. So like there was still like this deep connection to like the idea of like, I am a proud Chinese citizen, and my children are proud Chinese citizens, and we just want to be included in this discourse. And sometimes that involved like being like quite political, right? So like these are like the same parents that went like in Beijing to protest against like the radio and like in public media department, to be like, hey, you put out this thing that says that homosexuality is wrong, and then the parents physically went there with a stack of papers with like, here's all the signatures of people that love our kids, and this is not wrong, and and they were super informed. That's the other thing. Like they were like, here's the time that this was taken out of this of the description of the list of diseases. This is why you can't say that. It is not perversion. So they do all of that. So they are like the most activist of the bunch. While the young children, like the kids, like these young adults are a lot more like, my mom is doing that. I'm kind of keeping it on the down low. I'm taking my parents. I'm happy that things are okay, but I'm more worried about, keeping a job and finding like then studying, like, because that's the thing, like the implications on a social scale, like for these kids that are like 18 to like 30, they know that like they can't be out in society as much as they are at home, because there are still like very high social risks.
I have a question from the online, if you'd like to take one of those.
You go back there.
Oh, okay. You want to take this one first?
Sure. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm Jensen. I'm from a vice chairperson from a local society called Society True Light, which is we focused on what are we doing? We focus to ban conversion therapy in Hong Kong. And we also promote like mental health, like affirmative practices among mental health workers, right? I just have a question. Like, have you ever done some like comparative like analysis between like, for example, like mainland Chinese and also like Hong Kong Chinese, maybe like? Why am I saying this? Because like as a Chinese, like in the Chinese community, right? We really focus on the value of family. I think to promote like acceptance of queer, acceptance of LGBT plus, it's very important for the parents to come out and to show their support to their children, and also to other like strict people, saying that okay, like being gay or being transgender is not disease, so it's not problem and stuff, right? But I think we are having a very like difficult situation in Hong Kong, is that it is very difficult for us to mobilize the parents to come out. But then like since people like they actually like, basically run by parents, it's like how do you guys do that?
I know. I would usually email them to see like what their strategy was, because like in part like that was also fascinating to me, to be like, how did you get all these people on board? But yes, like this is also like the story of a dissertation, that the way that this started, I was a little ambitious. I was like, I'm gonna do this comparison, and it's gonna be between the US, Italy, and East Asia. I was like, great. And then my dissertation committee was like, why don't you start with one? And I was like, oh, fine, I'm gonna do China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And then I was like, okay, start with China. And then I got there and I was like, yes, I do not want to be in this program for 20
in the
years.
future.
But yes, there is of course a lot of like cross-pollination. I mean, the whole history of the queer movement is even just linguistically speaking, like you cannot study that in China without like acknowledging like Hong Kong and Taiwan and all of that. But I haven't done a comparison for that.
Right.
So
Maybe
I'd
in
be
the
curious
future.
to see.
Yeah.
There's a lot that is going on that still like relies on this tactic. Like this is the thing that is giving me hope. And then it's also just fascinating for me to see, and I kind of like it, because it's like, oh, see, that one's right, one way or another, like my argument still stands. And that is like, it also speaks to one of the questions that was asked, because I like it has to do about like is the trans movement and trans groups, how are they operating in this? And interestingly enough, like with the tightening of conditions, trans groups are now the ones that are the most active, because they have managed to unlock like this similar strategy of using the parents to get health professionals on board, right? So there is this is like if you're interested in this, this brilliant friend of mine who's about to graduate from U Chicago with a PhD, he's writing exactly about that. His name is Xiao Gaozhou, and he's finding that there is a lot of work that is being done, because there is gatekeeping in the healthcare community, with like, especially with gender affirming care, where the practitioner will be on board, but then the person that's undergoing gender reassignment surgery, they have to prove that they will be ready to join normative society. And to do that, they have to get their family on board and be like, oh, you see, my parents will accept me as a woman or a man. And then they're like, oh, and then my work is fine, and I have a job, and then I make this much money. So there is a lot of that is going on, but the family is still the strategy to go, because usually they're like, okay, if you convince your parents are on board, you're probably okay.
Yeah, that's great.
So my takeaway from your talk was that the answer lies in the QR code. That was a great example that you gave at the beginning of your talk. So we have one of our UChicago PhD students jamming in the East Asian department. I'm going to paraphrase the question, but I'm going to send this to you. It's quite long. And bottom line is, are there characteristics of parents that are more open to the coming home concept? And then are there types of queer children who are more likely or less likely to be allowed to come home?
Oh, yes, yes. There's definitely a gender split. Most of the parents that I talked to were mothers. So there's definitely that. In terms of characteristics, though, they're all over the place. Like there were people that were like highly educated, already knew about like some of the gender terms and were like, okay, and then I got on board. And some people that had never heard that, right? Some people that had never like left their village until like their son came out and then convinced them to go to this event. Like that was like one of my wonderful conversations in one of those like sleepless nights. And I went like, it was like, it's basically like a fever dream for an ethnographer, because I was like out on the deck, like, and then the sun was coming up, and like I was stretching with another mom, and this mom was like, yeah, when I was little, I used to see like the sun come up from the field, and I thought that it was just this great ball of fire emerging from our field, because I had no idea. And I'm like, and now look at me, I'm on a cruise ship in the middle of the sea because my son is gay and came out, and we're good. So there's a lot of range in that sense. I forgot the other
And
part
on
of the question.
the children's.
On the children's side, yes, there is a little bit of, you know, that homonormative subject of like they were all like very studious kids, presenting like very normative. So the like even in terms of gender presentation, a lot of them were men, and then there was like this very clear awareness of that in the groups. They were trying to push a lot of like more inclusive work for women. So when I was on the cruise, at some point there was like a closed door event for women only, and that was, you know, about like talking about like sexual health and talking about like playfulness, and then part of that conversation was also like we need to figure out how to get included a little bit more. And in part that's also historical. It's just like the way that the queer groups developed in China. A lot of the initial funding came at the end of the 90s during the AIDS crisis, and a lot of the funding went to gay groups. So lesbians got basically the short end of the stick, and they had like to really fight for any visibility. So in terms of that, there's like this gender split, that it's mostly mothers, or at least it was mostly mothers, and mostly gay men.
And then, so what happens to the girls, number one, and then secondly, like one of my questions was, you know, in a one child per family structure, like there's a lot more pressure to bring that child home.
Yes. So what happens to the girls is that there is a lot less available to them. So a lot of them, well, not a lot of them, but a lot of them had stories of friends that were not able to come out to the parents, and they ended up marrying someone or being forced to marry someone. That was changing as I was there. So I wonder if the numbers have changed a little bit. So there's that. And then
The one child.
The one child policy, yes, that is fascinating, because that is also like one of the big reasons why like they were using that as an important thing to think about. And the next step for the parents was also to try and figure out how to get like adoptions. So that was also one of the invited speakers on the cruise, was this person from an American company that was like, they had like this whole very complicated system so that like gay people in China could adopt a child that was born in the US and didn't have an American passport. It was just mind blowing. So that was like the next step for the parents. It was also like I think a recruiting strategy of like, hey, do you have a gay child, but you also want to be a grandparent? Well, we provide that too. So there is a lot of that, but also the one child policy, like historically, like it's interesting because it had multiple effects that all like fed into the development of queer groups. Because like, of course, like families could only have one child, so it's a lot more pressure, so it's harder to come out. But then on the other side, there was a lot more investment from the parents put into this one child. So a lot of the times children could go and study in big cities, and then they had more freedom. And also the implementation of the one child policy socially, like from a societal standpoint, it did this big thing that it detached sexuality from procreation. So that was like a big sexual revolution for China when that came on, because like they went from like, you know, under Mao being like where sex is only reproductive to being in a situation where sex is very clearly not reproductive because we can only have one child. So it had like this dual
Mhm.
effect.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Multiplier.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. And I am Joanne, also friends of from Society of True Light. And I would like to ask about, because you mentioned the concept of social movement and social mobilization. So compared to most of the Western or the queer mobilization around the world, there's always tension between the state and anti-LGBT and also pro-LGBT. Do you see any kind of counter mobilization in the studies or in like P-flag encountering
Yeah.
during this?
At the time, no, which was wonderful, right? Because that's the thing. Like I'm from Italy, where like we've even like misunderstood it so much that it's called like the anti-gender movement. Like it's not even against gayness, it's gender. That's the problem. Like we don't even translate that because like then it's scarier if it stays in English. And I did not see that. Like that was fantastic. Like, I knew that I was not going to find some of the things that like I was familiar with. Like I knew that the church was not going to be a big issue in China, right? I even met with like a few queer kids that were like, yeah, we have a church group going on. I'm like, wow, this is like rare on so many levels. This is amazing. So I did not see that. I do wonder if that is going to happen, because just like that's the thing, like with more visibility, there's usually like if you become an official movement visible to everyone, then there is a counter movement that is somewhere lurking. But so far, no. And in part, I think it is like they are like living off like this indifference that in a sense is helpful, right? Because the idea is not that it's wrong, it's just like a lot of people don't care, don't know about it. And then the biggest issues are within the family, right? Like a lot of the pressure and a lot of the issues that come up are in the family. And then of course there's like this other gigantic issue of, you know, that is particularly for people who are presenting that like non-binary people or trans people, that then there is like on the work perspective, that is like the other big thing that groups are taking on. But that is a different beast, because that does require legislation and does require policy.
I have another online question.
Yeah.
The audience member was asking if you have any experience with how minorities in China are dealing with these issues, number one. And then the second question is, in the case of trans people in particular, do you find and have you found that there are community groups online that can help people that are trans?
Yeah, I do not know about minorities. Like that did not come up. It was in part like not my framing, so I was blind to that. But also, I just did not. That was not a conversation that was being that was happening at the time. In terms of trans group, yes. So when I was there, that was kind of the beginning. So there were like at the time, I think 3 or 4 visible like groups that were specifically trying to help trans people. And then the Beijing LGBT Center had like this thing that was continuously growing, and they were helping a lot, like providing a lot of mental health support. But that is the part of the community that has grown exponentially since I've left the field. And that's where like I see that, and I love that I do know the person that is working on this, because we were very close at UChicago. He's like a few years behind me, and I just met with him. He's just returned from the field, and it was like, it's fascinating because like I read your book and then I see what's going on, and like I am the next step, and that's like trans groups have really ramped it up. And it's interesting because they are able to get some funding connecting that to like health funding, so they're managing to do that. So there's quite a bit going on these days.
Are you finding that Chinese NGOs are now supporting the communities as opposed to maybe Western NGOs that might have operated in the past?
Yes, in part because also that just it's very hard for any foreign NGOs to get any funding to groups locally. So it's the stuff that is going on, a lot of it is local. Even PFLAG, like the funding was like from a private founder, and then it was like a lot of fundraising, but all done locally. Because there were a few groups that were operating transnationally when I started doing this research, and they had to, like when the NGO law passed, they had to just change their model because it was impossible for them to operate.
Thank you, Professor Fugazzola, for this fascinating talk. And my question is kind of out of personal curiosity, but as we know, there's a stereotype for Italians to also have a more family-oriented culture. And I'm wondering, do you see a similar strategy of mobilizing the family-centric narrative, or is it mostly like the more right-based individualistic narratives?
Yeah, so first of all, I love that because it was one of the things that allowed me to connect with a lot of the participants that I was talking to. Like I very quickly in the field, I realized that I was going to get so much more ground by introducing myself as Italian instead of like, oh, hi, I'm a student at Chicago. Like no one cared about that. America was just like, yeah, okay, fine, American. But when they heard that I was Italian, immediately it was like, wait, Italian, you understand family. So yes and no, like Italy is also kind of split geographically. We're tiny, but we managed to not get along with each other. So in like mobilization in the north is very much like right based. This is actually interestingly enough my first like MA paper. That's what I was talking about, like how groups in Italy managed to use like different framing of the family to achieve the same purpose north and south, even though like the understanding was very different. But in the south was a lot more towards like understanding that this was like a family issue, and it was something for the family, and it's important like calling things family. So that was it still holds. And also just like anecdotally, I have like friends that have like this very interesting experience when they're like from a small village in the south, so like very stressed when they came out. And then the immediate reaction was that now the whole village is basically an activist village, because they were like, we don't care about politics anymore. Like if you're one of the community, if you're gay, we are pro-gay, which to me was just like, this is wonderful. This is just, it should be like a case study. Your one experience should be a case study. It doesn't always happen that way, but it still maps.
Thanks for the talk. I'm the deacon of an LGBTQ affirming church in Hong Kong. Very few, very rare. Thank you for all the talk earlier. I want to ask a question about PFLAG's rebranding, because they rebranded to another name. Yep. Because of different political issues in China that's going on, different shifting perspectives. And I'm curious, have you followed up with them recently? And like after the rebranding, are they actually getting smaller, or are they actually getting bigger but splintered out into like different sub-factions?
I've heard different stories. So I think like they are less visible, but I think that's kind of a choice. So I think they're focusing more on the smaller groups and like on the parents acting, and they're doing less large scale events.
I see.
So I think that is what's happening, that they're like, they've gotten so big that they're like, we don't really need the giant branding. Like people won't find us because they Google it online, but they will find us because someone knows someone that knows someone. Wow. So I think that was like their changing strategy, which worked because they were quite big. So at this point, like if you go anywhere and there's someone being like, I don't know how to come out to my parents, at some point they're going to
talk about
someone that recommends PFLAG. So that's my sense of what's happening. And I spoke like relatively recently with Hachan, with the executive director, when he might still be in the US. And it was like, yeah, things are not great, but also we're still like very hopeful. We're still doing our work, and just because we're not super visible, I think there's still like there was still that optimism of like we are changing little things, like one little thing at a time, and then seeing how that goes.
I'd love to connect with them.
Yeah.
Oh, one more question. We'll wrap it up. Anybody?
All right.
I think that concludes our evening with you. I'm sure there'll be many other questions, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, now thanks to our online audience too. I mean, that's fantastic. We're so lucky to have Professor Fugazzola at the University of Chicago. So much energy. I'm sure you. What's that? There was, from a PhD student from Chicago. They got up early. Anyway, thanks everybody for joining tonight, and for everybody online. Just two reminders. We still have the now award-winning best exhibition in Hong Kong going on in our heritage site. The 120th anniversary of the Hong Kong Tramways, Tramtail. So that's going on until the end of August. And finally, I just wanted to remind you that season 2 for the course podcast, which Hugh asked me the other day, he thought this was a podcast that was actually produced in Chicago. It's actually produced here in Hong Kong, and it was one of the children of one of our staff members, Gigi, who's up there in the corner. So, and Kate's there. Okay, I haven't listened to your episode yet, so that's my plan for tonight when I get home. Anyway, thanks everybody for joining. That's about it for us for the rest of the summer. I do want to mention, and I don't know if we have a slide on this, but the team here has been working for the last month and a half or so to put together the second US presidential election series coming up in September. So that'll be a series of 4 episodes coming up in September. It's going to be a real interesting election season in the US, and we want to try to help you all understand what's actually going on with that. So thanks again for coming, and have a great evening, everybody.